My name is Julia Foster, 25 years old. The memory hits me like the smell of store-bought cake, sickly sweet, impossible to ignore. I was 12 the day I sprinted into the living room with my acceptance letter crumpled in my fist, breath sharp, thinking this one paper might finally rearrange the house we lived in. The living room looked like a page from a magazine: glass, chrome, a perfect leather sofa that swallowed shadow. It glittered and lied. Susan, my stepmother, with her neat accountant grin and habit of measuring people like line items, was already in the middle of a rehearsal for glory. Streamers, a banner, balloons she'd insisted on hauling out an hour early. Amanda, my sister, was at the center, all effortless smiles and hair that always seemed to catch light. She radiated applause like heat. I remember the exact second the hope popped in me, my chest a sudden drumbeat, and the way it fell silent when I said, I got in. Expectation made my mouth light. I expected the room to tilt, for my letter to be examined the way Amanda's was. Instead, Susan glanced up, her smile skimming my face like wind across a pond. That's nice, she said, and returned to fussing over Amanda's party playlist. It was the same pattern I'd learned to wear like winter clothing. The forced smile, the small praise that felt carefully rationed, the unspoken ledger that assigned value. From the outside, we were a neat, successful family. My father, Robert Foster, was a construction engineer, always with a blueprint under his arm and a blueprint in his mind. He loved the math of how things fit, but he had the weary habit of believing calm was more useful than conflict. He'd come home from job sites with sawdust in his hair and fold into the sofa like a man who'd outsourced his feelings. He loved us in the way people who love by inertia love, steady, reliable, and sometimes useless in a crisis. Susan loved predictability. She loved investment. That was her word for everything. We have to invest wisely, she'd say, as if affection were a balance sheet to be audited quarterly. Amanda was her safe bet, bright in speech and drama, good at being seen. I learned early that when Susan called someone an investment, that person got the best of everything. The flashy birthday, the summers and photos, the immediate calls from proud relatives. On the day of my 8th birthday, the difference landed like a physical thing. My cake was small, waxy frosting that cracked when you touched it. Amanda's birthday 2 months later was a neighborhood carnival, a live band, string lights, a magician who pulled a rabbit out of a hat and made it all look effortless. I can still hear the echo of my small voice asking Susan, why wasn't mine like that? She mussed my hair and said, Amanda needs a boost to stand out. You're fine with something smaller, right? She meant it like mercy. I felt it as exile. The slights were not always loud. They were threaded into holidays, report cards shoved aside, patent praise heaped on Amanda for her debate trophies, while my straight A's were swallowed into drawers. Each small dismissal stacked into a wall I began to climb. I learned early that being noticed required work. Not the kind that grades or talent paid for, but the kind that made exposure inevitable. Grit, volume, demonstrable wins. So I sketched. I took refuge in the patient architecture of rooms and porches and windows that looked like they kept secrets. Pencil on paper became my counter voice. If my family wouldn't applaud me, my lines would. I drew houses where every corner had been given thought, where thresholds welcomed, where nobody felt like an extra. On the inside cover of my first sketchbook, I wrote, half as a joke and half as a prayer, houses that remember their people. It was a line Aunt Nancy, my father's older sister, a wiry woman with a lifetime of design books stacked like firewood in her bungalow, would later point to and say, keep that, it's your spine. Nancy was the opposite of our glossy living room. Her house lived. She had fabric swatches hanging like flags, a stack of drafting paper with nicotine gum wrappers wedged between the sheets, and a desktop computer that whined like an old dog. She took me in on Saturday mornings, handed me pencils, and asked me to show her what I saw. Her encouragement had a weight to it that felt like currency. You can change how people live, she told me once, tapping my sketch. You can build places that matter. It's one thing to be noticed at home, it turned out, and another to be seen by someone who believed you could do something with your hands and heart. At school, I found Emily Carson. Loud, blunt, the kind of loyal you only saw in movies until you found one in real life. She believed I would outgrow the smallness in my house, and she pushed me into contests, into openings, into the kind of exposure I didn't know how to ask for. When we won a playground design contest in middle school, her scream echoed through the auditorium. That was the first time the world outside my living room cheered for me loud enough that the sound stuck. Home never shifted because of one paper or an award. When the time came for college funding, the ledger on Susan's table told the next story. "We've crunched the numbers," she said formally, as if reading a quarterly report. "Amanda's tuition was covered in full. Mine?" "You're resourceful. Scholarships, loans," she suggested, as though tenderness and financing were the same thing. My father, who loved me in a measured way, let the silence between them become the decision. That night, I taught myself how to juggle ovens and architectural rendering software. I worked 20 hours a week at a bakery. I lived on the cheapest dorm plan, counted ramen like a currency, and learned the humbling mathematics of independence. University was brutal and intoxicating. Architecture taught you that structure grows out of constraint. You must design in the face of what you can't have. It suited me. Professor Michael Hull, Dr. Hull, a man with kind, exacting eyes, pulled me aside after a critique and said, "Your work has heart. Keep pushing." Those words were oxygen. I poured myself into a project no one told me to love: sustainable, affordable homes for families who'd never been built for. I wanted to make the kind of houses that remembered people, the phrase snaking back to the scribble in my sketchbook. There were nights I melted into studio chairs with coffee rings on my palms and flour on my apron. There were moments when exhaustion made me almost barter my principles for an extra hour of sleep. But then small things happened: a community honor, a third-place regional award, a call from a junior architect impressed enough to want to see more. It felt like the world was offering me a chance to be loud in a language it understood: results. Still, I'd learned to be cautious about hope. The living room that glittered on the outside taught me the cost of assuming you belonged somewhere you weren't invited to. It taught me to carry my victories like tools, not trophies. Each success became a wedge I could slide under the lid of contempt and pry it open. The acceptance letter, the one that had first made my heart fling toward the ceiling, is the memory that keeps looping. It was the first time I believed the possibility that my life could be rearranged not by a family ledger, but by the slow, stubborn work of building. I held it then and felt something like a map. I also felt the balloon string in Susan's hand as she looped it through the banner for Amanda's party, a small tangible that she'd chosen. That night I learned two truths I'd carry. People can be both tender and blind, and sometimes the thing that hurts you the most is the way the people who should protect you consider you a budgetary line item rather than a person. I kept sketching. I kept believing. The small, private hope in my book, Houses That Remember Their People, didn't seem naive anymore. It felt like a contract I had with myself. Outside, the band finished a chorus, and Amanda's laughter floated through the open windows. I folded my acceptance letter back into an envelope and tucked it inside my sketchbook like a secret. The room applauded, and I learned to make my own noise. Years later, I would understand that day was less about rejection and more about revelation, the kind of quiet moment that rearranges your soul without warning. Because from that point on, I stopped waiting for applause. I built my own stage. By the time I graduated, my name, Julia Foster, had started showing up on local architecture blogs. "The girl who builds with heart," one headline said, next to a photo of me squinting into sunlight with a hard hat a size too big. I laughed when I saw it, but secretly, I taped that clipping inside my closet door. It wasn't fame. It was proof that I existed beyond that house. And it was around that time I met Charles Jones. Charles wasn't the kind of man who announced himself. He had that calm confidence, the kind that doesn't need to shout. We met at a construction site in downtown Raleigh, both there for different reasons. I was interning for a firm. He was part of the supplier's engineering team. I remember how he noticed the small things, the way I rolled my blueprints with the label facing outward, how I tilted my head when I was deep in thought. He brought me coffee the second day. "Architects don't sleep, right?" he'd joked. I smiled, probably too wide. "Only when the concrete's drying." That became our rhythm. Banter, then warmth. We started sharing lunch breaks in half-built spaces that smelled of sawdust and promise. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not compared, not evaluated, just understood. Charles had an instinct for steadiness, and I needed that. When I brought him home for dinner 6 months later, Susan's eyes flicked over him like she was scanning a resume. "So," she said between bites of her meticulously arranged salad, "what do you do, Charles?" "I'm in structural engineering," he answered easily. "Mostly material analysis, sustainability focus." "Ah," Susan said. "So you're in support work, not design." I felt my stomach tighten. My father chuckled politely. Amanda stirred her wine, and Charles just smiled. "Support makes the design possible," he said softly. That's when I knew he could handle them. But something about that dinner changed things. Susan began inviting Amanda's fiancé, Daniel, to every family brunch after that. He was an investment banker. Flashy, articulate, the sort of man who introduced himself like he was shaking hands with a mirror. My father adored him instantly. I, meanwhile, had a desk job and a savings account that barely survived rent. When Amanda and Daniel got engaged, the family threw a weekend-long celebration at our lake house. Susan went all out. Catered dinner, floating candles, even a violinist. I offered to design the wedding arch as a gift. She smiled and said, "That's sweet, Julia, but Daniel's friend knows someone more experienced." I didn't argue. I just nodded and walked down to the water, where Charles found me skipping stones. "Hey," he said, sliding his hand into mine. "You okay?" "Yeah," I lied. "Just thinking." He looked at me, really looked. "You're not the kind of person they can overlook forever." He was wrong about the forever, because the next morning I realized maybe they wouldn't overlook me. Maybe they'd need me. It started when my father called, voice tight. "Jules, the firm I invested in with Daniel. Something's off. Money's missing." I froze. Daniel, my brother-in-law-to-be, had been running some kind of side deal using my father's name. Quietly. Illegally. The house that had always dismissed me was about to collapse, and I was the only one who could rebuild it. It started small. A whisper of panic in my father's voice, something I'd never heard before. "Julia, I just need you to look at something," he said. "You're good with numbers, with systems." When I arrived at the house, Susan was pacing the kitchen, clutching a stack of printed statements. Amanda sat at the counter, her mascara smudged, her diamond engagement ring flashing with every tremble of her hand. "He said it was just a short-term investment," Susan kept repeating. "Just temporary. Daniel promised." But Daniel was gone. Not disappeared, just unavailable. His phone rang, then went straight to voicemail. His assistant said he was traveling for business. The truth, however, was in the documents my father spread across the dining table. Falsified contracts, missing signatures, and account transfers to a shell company in Daniel's name. I scanned each page, my brain switching into the calm, mechanical rhythm I used for design reviews. "Dad," I said slowly, "this isn't an error. He's been moving your money for months." "How much?" my father asked, his voice cracking. I looked up. "About 200,000. The silence that followed was cavernous. Susan sank into a chair. Amanda stared at me, her voice small. "He said it was an investment for us, for our future." For a long time, I'd dreamed of this moment. The family realizing I wasn't invisible. But standing there, watching them break apart, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. "I'll fix it," I said quietly. My father blinked. "How could you possibly—" "I don't mean the money," I replied, "but I can make sure he doesn't ruin you, or anyone else." That night, I called Charles. He listened without interruption, then said, "You're going to need proof, real proof." Over the next week, we worked like ghosts. Charles dug into Daniel's business dealings through his company's internal contacts. I traced paper trails, matching dates and document codes. What we found was worse than we expected. Daniel had used my father's credentials to secure loans and fake property valuations. He hadn't just stolen from us. He'd built his success on us. When we finally had enough evidence, I went to my father again. "You can take this to the police," I said, "but it'll be public. Or you can let me handle it quietly." He looked at me for a long time, exhaustion hollowing his face. "Julia, I don't want revenge." "I'm not after revenge," I said. "I just want balance." The confrontation happened at the engagement party that Susan insisted must still go on. Appearances matter. Daniel arrived late, his usual charm polished to perfection. He hugged Amanda, smiled at my father, and clinked his glass to make a toast. To family, he said. That's when I stepped forward. To honesty, I added. He froze. Interesting thing about your company, Daniel, I continued, my voice calm, steady. Its foundation is as hollow as your promises. Whispers began to ripple through the guests. I slid a folder across the table. Contracts, screenshots, signatures, proof. Daniel's face drained of color. You don't know what you're talking about, he hissed. Oh, I do, I said, meeting his eyes. You used my father's trust like currency. You built your empire on fraud. And unless you want every investor here to know exactly what you've done, you'll sign a full restitution agreement. Right now. For a moment, he tried to laugh it off, but the documents spoke louder than any of us. Charles had already filed a preliminary notice with the SEC. Daniel was cornered. By the end of the night, the engagement was broken, the guests gone, and my father, for the first time, looked at me with something that felt like awe. You saved us, he said softly. No, I replied. I just stopped you from falling. Susan didn't speak for days. Amanda moved back in with her, quieter, older somehow. My father tried to bridge the gap. Dinners, calls, the awkward beginnings of gratitude. I didn't hold a grudge. I just learned that sometimes the people who underestimate you teach you how to become unshakable. Charles held me close one night and said, You didn't just fix your family, Julia. You rebuilt the foundation. And maybe that's what it was, not revenge, not justice, just architecture, designing a structure strong enough to stand on your own. Charles and I spent the next few nights piecing everything together. The missing funds, the shell companies, the false invoices. Daniel had used my father's signature on a few of them. My stomach sank when I realized it wasn't a mistake. It was planned. Charles was the one who found the link. A contractor Daniel had supposedly paid, but the account led to an offshore firm under a fake name. Same initials, same dates. I remember staring at the laptop screen and whispering, He's stealing from my family. Charles didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, calm, steady, then we show them. It wasn't about revenge at first. It was about truth. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized how deep the hypocrisy ran. My parents, who had always idolized Amanda's perfect match, hadn't noticed how Daniel used them, because he told them what they wanted to hear. So I gathered everything, the transfers, the shell accounts, the emails. Charles helped me organize it into a report, precise and undeniable. The night before Amanda's engagement party, I printed it all and slipped it into a sealed envelope. At dinner, the house was glowing with fairy lights and laughter. My parents were radiant, Amanda sparkled, and Daniel worked the room like a man already crowned. When my father raised a toast, I stood up. My hands were steady. Dad, I said softly, before you say anything else, I think you should see this. The room fell silent. I slid the envelope across the table. He opened it, confusion turning into disbelief. My mother leaned in, gasped quietly. Daniel's smirk faltered. What is this? My father asked, voice trembling. Proof, I said, of what Daniel's been doing with your investments. The missing money didn't disappear. He moved it. Amanda's glass slipped from her hand and shattered. Daniel stood, color draining from his face. That's ridiculous, he snapped. She's jealous. Really? I said evenly, because the accounts are in your name, and the fake invoices were traced back to your laptop. For a moment, no one breathed. Then my father said, barely a whisper, Get out. Daniel tried to argue, but the silence in that house was louder than any shouting could have been. He left that night, not just the party, but Amanda's life. I didn't stay for this cleanup. I walked out into the cold air, my heart pounding not from victory, but from something sharper, freedom. Later, my father called. Julia, I don't know how to thank you. I smiled faintly. You don't have to. Just see me. For the first time, he did. A year later, I stood at the groundbreaking ceremony for my own architecture firm, Foster Design Studio. My parents were in the front row. Amanda, too, quieter now, gentler. When I looked up, I saw Charles watching from the side, pride in his eyes. And I realized all those years of being overlooked weren't wasted. They were training. Every silence had taught me how to listen, every dismissal, how to observe, every heartbreak, how to rebuild. Because sometimes the foundation you build from pain ends up stronger than anything that ever stood before it. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows of my office, spilling gold across the blueprint table. The city outside buzzed awake, cranes moving, traffic humming. the sound of life being rebuilt, piece by piece. I stood in front of the window, coffee in hand, watching the skyline that once felt so impossibly distant. Every building out there carried a story. But this one, Foster Design Studio, was mine. The walls were lined with sketches from our first projects, community homes, schools, small spaces that meant something. I'd chosen them deliberately, reminders of where it all began and why I started in the first place. My name, Julia Foster, was now on the front door in clean, bold lettering. Every time I saw it, I remembered the girl who used to sit quietly at family dinners, measuring her worth in silence. She wouldn't recognize this woman. And maybe that's a good thing. My parents visited more often now. My father always brought the same brand of coffee beans he once mocked me for buying. Chef said it was too strong. My mother came too, pretending to help with the decor, but really just staying long enough to linger, to watch me work. Sometimes she'd pause, look around the office with a softness I'd never seen before. "You built this," she said one day, her voice catching. "All by yourself." I smiled. "No, not by myself, just on my own terms." She nodded, and for once there was no comparison, no subtle critique, just pride. Amanda had changed in ways I didn't expect. After Daniel's scandal, she left the city for almost a year. She wrote me letters, hesitant at first, then honest. She told me about the nonprofit where she helped rebuild homes for struggling families. She said it made her feel useful again. When she came back, she stopped by one of my project sites, hair tied up, sleeves rolled. "Need an extra pair of hands?" she asked, smiling nervously. I didn't say anything. I just handed her a hammer. We worked in silence until sunset, the kind that said more than words could. And then there's Charles. He's not just my partner. He's the reason I still believe in calm after chaos. We bought an old brick warehouse by the river, the same one where we met years ago when everything was half-built and uncertain. We turned it into our shared studio. He runs the engineering side now. I run design. We argue about lighting plans and laugh about deadlines. But every day I look at him and think, this is what steady feels like. That evening, as twilight spilled across the city, I walked to the window again. The skyline glowed, the buildings I'd helped design standing tall, steady, proud. Charles came up behind me, his reflection merging with mine in the glass. "You know," he murmured, "5 years ago, you said you just wanted to prove you could stand on your own." I smiled. "And now?" "Now," he said, kissing the side of my head, "you've built a world that stands because of you." Outside, the city pulsed with light, alive, imperfect, beautiful. And for the first time, I felt no bitterness, no ache to be understood, just peace. Because somewhere along the way, I learned that being seen was never the goal. Building something worth looking at, that was. I took one last sip of coffee, the kind my dad brought every week, and whispered softly, almost to myself, "Family first." Not the kind that breaks you to fit their mold, but the kind you build, with love, with work, with time, brick by brick, choice by choice, until one day you look around and realize you're finally home.